Okay, good evening. And Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. We are in the middle of Parag Gimel, Sefer Ezra. And what I'm going to do is we did the first three psukim. I'm just going to read them again just to kind of get us into it. And we're going to pick up Pasuk Dalet. My guess is that we will not get very far tonight beyond maybe a couple of psukim, because we're going to spend some time looking at different perspectives of these couple of psukim. Okay, so again, Parak Gimel Pasuk Aleph, just the first three psukim we've already discussed. I'm just reading them once again just to start the ball rolling. Vayigah Chodesh HaShvi'i, in the 7th month arrived, which is Tishrei. Uvnei Yisrael be'arim, and the Bnei Yisrael had settled in their cities after they had come back from the Galut. Vayei Am ki ishachad el Yerushalayim, and all the people then gathered as one into the city of Yerushalayim. Vayakom Yeshua ben Yotzadak ve'achav HaKohanim, Yeshua, who was at that time serving as the Kohen Gadol, and his fellow Kohanim, Uzu Bavel ben Shaltiel ve'achav. What did they do? Vayivnu et Mizbach Elokei Yisrael. They built the Mizbeach of Hashem. And remember, we said that they're saying that in that way because that we're not just saying that it was Mizbeach, but it was their perspective. It was their desire to come close to Hashem through this. What were they going to do with it? Laha'alot alav olot, to bring upon it korbanot. Kakatuv b'Torat Moshe Shalokim is written in the book of the Torah through Moshe, through a man of God. Gimel, vayachinu hamizbeach al mechonotav, and they established the mizbeach on its base. Ki be'ima alehem me'ameh haratzot, because they were in fear. And this is what I'm going to mention. We'll start with this. They were in fear of the people around them. Vayalu olav olot laHashem. They brought korbanot on it. Olot laboker v'la'arev. Olot in the morning and in the evening. Which of course should recall to you the concept of the Korban Tamid. The Korban Tamid was brought one in the morning and once in the evening. It was the first Korban of the day, last Korban of the day. And just as an aside, which some of you may be familiar with, and if not, it's worth hearing, I believe. There is a set of Svarim called the Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is a compilation of the Agadah, or the stories, the legend, lore throughout the Shas Bavli. And in the introduction, there is a discussion that is mentioned as to what is considered the most important pasuk in the Torah. That's a strange question, but it's dealt with. One opinion is it's Shema Yisrael, sensible. Another is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God, also sensible. And then comes the one that's totally out of left field, which is Etakeves Echad Taseh Baboker, Etakeves Hasheni Taseh Ben Arbaim. Specifically talking about this Korban, the Korban Tamid, that you brought a Korban in the morning and the Korban in the late afternoon, the early evening. So the first one saying this, the most important pasuk, Shema Yisrael, I understand. The second possibility, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I understand. What's this idea to say, according to one opinion, the most important pasuk in the Torah is Etakeves Echad Taseh Baboker, Etakeves Hasheni Taseh Ben Arbaim. And they would bring the Korban Tamid once in the morning and once in the evening. So I'm sure there are plenty of drashot written on it. The one I've heard multiple times that I think really speaks to me personally, and I'm sharing with you, is, and I think that's important, I'll show you why I think it's important to mention it all together, is that we all go through ebbs and flow, growth and maybe regression in our Judaism, in the way we serve Hashem. Hopefully more in the proper direction of growth. Sometimes we go through the kufot, or time periods where things may be not as strong, maybe or what is our emunah, or various mitzvot, or tefillah. So we have sometimes it's up and down. But we do know that we still have, whether we are, quote, into it or not into it, we still have obligations. You know, it's easy to get excited about Tkiyat Shofar. It's easy to get excited about putting up a mezuzah. It's easy to get excited about lighting Ner Chanukah, because they don't come that frequently. Things that you deal with every day, putting on tefillin every week, lighting the Shabbat candles, whatever. The things that are tamidi, things that are have some frequency to them, it's a little bit harder to get into that necessarily and to feel super excited, even though we're supposed to. So what's this idea of this? That the third opinion that the most important pasuk in the Torah, obviously there's no more or less important, but it's metaphorically speaking, is this idea of the Korban Tamid, because it's teaching us a lesson. There is no day off from serving Hashem. Everything we do has a sense of permanence to it. In the morning we're religious, in the evening we're religious, in between we're religious, and Torah is our guide from in between the morning and the evening. I think it's significant to mention that at this point here, because the first mention now of Korbanot, when they returned from Galut, is that they mentioned that they brought the Korban Tamid. So they're starting off on the right foot. What's going to be a little surprising when we move a little bit ahead in the next couple of psukim, when we start talking about Sukkot and compare Ezra and Nehemiah, we'll see why this is a little bit more surprising. But at least right now, Apanim, at like first blush, we see that the message is there also for Am Yisrael. Okay, so let's take, so why is there this be'ema aleim? What were they afraid of? So I don't have a slide for this. I'm just going to read you one line from the Malbim. The Malbim asked the question, as do other commentaries, what were they afraid of? He says like this. You'll notice if you look in Pasuk Bet, it says Yeshua ben Yotzadak and his fellow Kohanim and Zubavel Shaltiah and his brothers came and they built the Mizbeach to bring the Korbanot. But then they really finished it and got it prepared, and they started to bring korbanot only after, when did they all do this? In the prior Pasuk Aleph, what happened there? They came, they were all sitting in these cities, meaning Yeshua ben Yotzadak and Zubavel, and these people were already in Yerushalayim. In the meantime, all the other Bnei Yisrael come to Yerushalayim, and only then do they build this Mizbeach. Why? Why did they wait for all of Am Yisrael who were there to come? They did not make the Mizbeach until this moment. They were afraid that the people that were living there, not the Jews, would cause them to have to stop their work. Because there were only a few people. In other words, if just a few Kohanim are trying to build this, then they could easily run into trouble with the unions of the non-Jews to come after them, which we're going to see in the next chapter they do anyways. But the original hesitation, or the reason they waited till there were a larger group of people in Yerushalayim to build a Mizbeach, was because they were afraid that they would run into trouble with the non-Jews who were going to try to maybe even forcefully stop them. Okay, let's take a look then at the next pasuk. Pasuk Dalet, number 4. Vaya'asu et Chag HaSukkot kakatuv. They did the holiday, they kept the holiday of Sukkot as is written, meaning in the Torah. Ve'olat yom biyom b'mispar. And I mentioned this when we first read the parak last week, that they would bring the amount of korbanot each day. Remember that during the week of Sukkot, that they would bring every day X amount of bulls that would represent the nations of the world, a total at the end of the week of 70 bulls that were brought, the Shivim Parei HaChag, Kimishpat Dvar Yom B'yomo, as was required of each day. Read a couple more psukim, then we're going to stop and go into a number of commentaries. And after that, Pasuk Hey, number 5. And then after Sukkot, they started getting into a regular routine. The monthly korbanot, still the daily korban tamid, and in every one of the holidays, they would bring the proper korbanot for that holiday. And for all those who wanted to bring a korban, just to bring a korban as a nidava, or as a donation, as a free will offering to Hashem. And it tells us also in Pasuk Vav, from the beginning of Chodesh Shvi'i, meaning from the first day Rosh Hashanah, it says that then they already had been bringing korbanot starting then. But they had yet to lay the foundation for the actual Beit HaMikdash. So we talked last week also that a couple things. Number one, that it was not necessary for them to build the Beit HaMikdash before they would bring korbanot. That was first of all. I also mentioned that could be very encouraging for us nowadays to say, well, what are the circumstances that would allow us today to be able to build a Mizbeach without a Beit HaMikdash and to start bringing korbanot. I'm going to leave that open-ended at the moment. And in addition to that, the question was raised, and not only just briefly I touched on it, is how do they know where they would build the Beit HaMikdash? How do they know how to build the Mizbeach? I mean, even the people who had been the first Beit HaMikdash, that doesn't mean they knew the exact dimensions and how to build the Mizbeach. Think about it. Let's assume for a moment you've been to the Kotel. Now, the Kotel is not part of the Beit. I know you all know this, but it's important to say it because if anybody hears this video at some point later on, the Kotel, the Western Wall, the Southern Wall, the Eastern, that wall is not the Beit HaMikdash. It is a retaining wall that prevented the mountain from collapsing when the Beit HaMikdash would be built on top. However, it still has a level of Kedusha. Ad kedei kach that there are some opinions, not the majority, but some opinions you're not even allowed to put ptakim. You can't put a petek inside the wall because it's already considered me'ilah. You're using the wall, which has Kedusha, for something that's not Kadosh. Okay, but let's assume for a moment you've been to the Kotel 150 times, and then we had to replicate it somehow from memory. I mean, chances are, unless you are a savant or have not just a photographic memory, but an eidetic memory, which is even more than that, you're not going to be able to do that. So how is it that they knew when they came back how to build it? So we know that there were three Nevi'im, Chagai, Malachi, Zechariah, that also came, and they each had a different tafkid or a different function in the rebuilding of the Mizbeach, and then eventually the Beit HaMikdash location, how to build it, where to build it, and the process. So that's how they just happen to know. It's not like Chas v'Shalom things like IKEA, that it came with an instruction manual on how to do it. I also think it's, yeah.
Did they have paraduma?
I mean, as far as making sure that they would be not Tameim, right? Yeah, so I came across, I was reading something, now that you mentioned me, I kind of like blew past something, I don't remember. I'd have to look back. It's it's a legitimate question. Right, very legitimate question.
Okay, mute me again, please. You can mute me again.
I'll mute you, okay. Can I do that in real life too?
Please.
Okay. I think it's also important to note that this week, yesterday, we began 5 parshiot, and 4 out of the next 5 that deal exclusively with the Mishkan, all the Kelim and the Mizbeach, of course. We have Truma Tetzaveh, Ki Tisa has a little bit, and then back to Vayakel and Pekudei. Truma Tetzaveh is basically the plan, the blueprint, and Vayakel Pekudei is the execution of the blueprint and actually building the actual Mishkan. So our timing of learning about the first time when they are coming back, Shivat Zion, to rebuild the first steps towards the Beit HaMikdash is very timely for us, doing it starting during the time of Trumat Tetzaveh. Okay, so if you look at these psukim, I'd like to know your opinion. What do you think? What was the mood? It's hard to tell, but what would you intuit? Is the mood in the time of Sukkot? Did they know what they were doing? Did they enjoy the Chag? What would you think was going on here? And if you don't have an idea, it's fine. You can just guess at something too, just based only on the text.
It just seems like they were getting their feet wet. There's like sort of, getting themselves refamiliarized with, with all the traditions and what they have to do. And it's been so long. It was so long since they were there that it's almost like a first run kind of thing. I don't know. I just get that feeling that they were novices at this.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other opinions? Okay. So we're going to look at a few things now. First, I want to share with you a couple items from Dat Sofrim. Then we're going to look at a comparison between these couple psukim and few psukim in Sefer Nehemiah. I'm also going to introduce you to a phenomenal online tool in learning Tanakh that I only discovered a couple of weeks ago. I'm sorry I didn't find this years ago. It's unbelievably powerful. I'll show you what it is in a little while. And then we're going to look at a brief comment about those 2 chapters. Okay, so let's go here. So we're going to discuss for a little while now The idea of the renewal of the holidays in Israel. Okay, so I'm going to look at it. Let's take a look. This is again the Dat Sofrim. The first holidays is celebrated in the new Yerushalayim. Bein maaseh tkufa zo shenechtav alehem ledorot. Among this time period, one of the things that's being written, as we see now, are the initial celebrations of the Chagim in Yerushalayim. That they left a practical impression for the coming days, and also from one time period to another. That not only did their celebration of the Chagim once again have an influence and impact in Israel, but it also had an influence and an impact on those who were in the Golah, in the Galut. And these days became almost a central influence on life at this point. So at this point, what it sounds like is similar to what Danny was saying, is that like, wow, like, I don't know exactly maybe what they were doing when they were in Galut. Maybe they were keeping the holidays, maybe they weren't keeping, but they certainly weren't bringing Korbanot. They certainly weren't in Yerushalayim, obviously. So these are the initial baby steps that then have a long-term hashpa'ah effect on the people. Et hachagim kmo kol hamitzvot ha'acherot. The chagim, like any other mitzvah, efshar lekayim bedargot shonot. They can be kept in different levels. Behitlavut, v'gam bekrirut. You can be kept. You can do a mitzvah with tremendous enthusiasm and love and spark of like fire to God, or you can do it cold, in a very cold way. Kime bitul melacha bilvad. You can look at it just as a day you're just not working. Or you can look at a holiday as a day of uplifting for your own personal and for the tzibur as a whole. Shel rosh hamishpacha, shel haisha v'hayeladim. Ad hayom emunot gedola hi lekayem et hakriya hanevuit chagei chagecha Yehuda. Okay, I don't want to do the rest of this paragraph here. Continue. Lifnei shenivneh Beit Hamikdash harishon. Before the first Beit Hamikdash was built, kasher chovat ha'aliyah l'regel l'shilo lo hayta muchletet. The idea of, was there a mitzvah to do what's called aliyah l'regel, which is the mitzvah that says shalosh pamim b'shana yira'eh kol zchurcha epnei either Hashem Elokecha or Adon Ha'el, that you had a mitzvah to go to Har HaBayit when the Beit HaMikdash was existed, that you had to go during Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot. You had the week after Shavuot also to go to Har HaBayit. You brought a korban. It was called korban. It was called the Olat Re'iyah. You had the mitzvah was lirot uleheraot. You had to see people and to be seen. The question before the Beit HaMikdash itself was built, which we're talking hundreds of years after Bnei Yisrael arrived in Israel, before the Beit HaMikdash was built, was there the mitzvah to go to Shiloh, which is where the Beit HaMikdash stood for, the Mishkan stood for 369 years, the majority of the time from coming into Israel until the Beit HaMikdash is built. It was not completely clear if there was such a mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel to go to Shiloh. V'zikaron ha'shi'abud b'Mitzrayim nireh haya ki devar sheshayach rak la'avar. Efshar ki hayu ha'chagim ach kimei Shabbat nosafim. It may have seemed that at that point, maybe the Chagim were celebrated just like a miniature Shabbat kind of thing, because there were still plenty of things that can be done even to this day that you can do on Chag that you cannot do on Shabbat. The truth is that the Beit HaMikdash, as a known entity, the first one, was only known by all of Am Yisrael as the central focus of Am Yisrael in a religious aspect, the serving God aspect, for a very short time. For those of you who remember learning Sefer Melachim, it was about 20 or 30 years, as he says in parentheses here, before there's a split in the kingdoms. Lachar miken, after that, Kimat ubatlah aliyah l'regel shel rov rubam shel hashvatim. What happened? We have this utopian view that you don't if you've learned Sefer Melachim, as we took 5 years to do, But you have this utopian view of there's a Beit HaMikdash and everyone was all getting to along and they would bring their korbanot and everyone would come to Yerushalayim. And the concept of all Am Yisrael truly coming to Yerushalayim for the Chagim was for a very short period of time. It was about 20 or 30 years. That was it. Because after the split, majority of the Jews lived in the northern kingdom, right? In Malchut Yisrael. And they either didn't want to or they were prevented, depending on the time period, from coming down to Yerushalayim to go to the Beit HaMikdash. ובהדרה בוודאי היה לב רבים משלומי אמוני ישראל שבורה בקרבם, אשר שאין להם אפשרות לקיים את החג ככתוב בתורה. And therefore, as a result, many, if not most, of the people were almost brokenhearted by their inability to properly keep the chag as written in the Torah. What does that mean to properly keep it? So they kept the chag, fine, but they didn't bring korbanot. You know, nowadays, Nebuch, we read about the korbanot. That's all we can do. We don't bring the korbanot. But then they could have brought them, but they didn't. Hamelachim Chizkiyahu v'Yoshiyahu asu ma'amatz atzum l'chadesh et pnei hachagim Yerushalayim. So both the two of the latter kings of Yehuda, Chizkiyahu and Yoshiyahu, tried their best to properly renew the way that the Chagim were celebrated in Yerushalayim. After the 10 Shvatim of the northern kingdom went into Galut, they tried in Yerushalayim, the Jews that were left, to try to make it as best as possible like it was in the Torah. So when it came back, it would seem from what we're reading here in this parak that the Bnei Yisrael went now to serve and act and do and keep the chag of Sukkot in the proper way, the best way, and as it says in the Torah, by bringing korbanot. But I went too fast. I want you to be familiar with this tool that I learned about recently. It's called alhatorah.org. And if you don't want to write it down or you don't remember it, remind me and I'll send it out in the group. There are many amazing sites and apps to learn Tanakh with. Now, today happens to be day number 1 in the 929 project. It takes over 1,100 days because 5 days a week, learning a parak a day of Tanakh. Today was Bereshit Aleph. So far, I'm 1 for 1. One down, 928 to go. Bezrat Hashem. Probably one of the more well-known sites that has exploded over the last couple of years is Sefaria. If you're not familiar with that, it's an absolute app to have on your phone, or you have a website that you're familiar with. You can do tremendous amounts of things with a ton, not just Tanakh, but a huge amount of books of our, whether it's Shulchan Aruch or Sidurim. There's so much on there. alhatorah.org takes it to the next level. And what it does, and I'll show you why I'm mentioning that, I'll show you why in a second. It not only allows you to search for stuff within Tanakh and all, but it allows you to make comparisons between psukim that you say, okay, I want to see this parak next to this parak. It allows you to say, okay, in this chapter or in this book, there's what word seems to repeat itself. We talked about this before, that what's called the milah mancha, a word that repeats itself or a phrase multiple times in a parak, in a sefer, specifically to make a point. It's not like you can open up a Torah and you have the words are bolded or highlighted, right? But this allows you to do that. So what I want to take a look at, we're going to take a look at the comparison of the story we just now read, or I don't like calling it a story, but the description here in Sefer Ezra, in a relatively short amount of time, just a couple of psukim, of what Sukkot and that time period looked like, compared to what it looks like in Perek Chet and Nehemiah. Okay, so let's take a look. I have to unshare this and share a different screen. Okay, maybe I'll make this a little bigger. Okay, we'll be all minimizing everybody here. I assume you can see my screen with where it says on one side it's Ezra and the other side is Nehemiah. So on the right hand side, what we just read. I have an extra pasuk there, pasuk zayin, which is not necessary for this discussion. Look on the left hand side. It's a little bit more wordy. I'm going to just kind of run through it and give a summary. I'm not going to read and translate every single word. Okay, pasuk Zayin on the left-hand side where it says Nehemiah. V'Yeshua v'vanav v'Sheravya Yamin Akuv Shabbatai Hodia Maaseya Klita Azarya Yozavad Hanan Playa Balavim Mevinim et Ha'am LeTorah v'Ha'am Al Umdam. First thing it tells us, which they don't tell us here in Ezra, is that all these individuals, they got up and they started to teach Torah to Am Yisrael. Vayikru b'sefer b'Torah Elokim meforash v'som sechel vayavinu b'mikra. When we get to Nehemiah, we'll go into much more depth in this particular parak. But basically, they were teaching them the Torah. They were also teaching them Ta'amei HaMikra, according to some opinions, which is the cantillation, the trop that we say in the psukim. Vayomer Nehemiah hu hatashata ve'Ezra Kohen hasofer v'halviim hamevinim et ha'am l'chol ha'am hayom l'chol ha'am. And those individuals, Nehemiah, Ezra, the Leviim, said to the people, Hayom kadosh hu Lashem Elokechem. Today is holy for God. Al titablu, do not mourn. Val tifku, and don't cry. Why do they have to tell them that? Ki bochim kol ha'am kishoma'am et divrei Torah. When the people heard, when the Torah was being read to them, and evidently it was being read, the sections about Rosh Hashanah, or it was being read to them about the punishments that could happen when you don't keep Torah, they started to cry. They started to be upset. And this happened to have been on Rosh Hashanah. Vayomer lahem, and he said to them, Lechu ichlu mashmani mushtu mamtakim b'shulchu manot le'en nachon manot. He says, go back home, eat and drink, and give gifts to, like food gifts to your neighbors, because today is a holiday. And do not be sad. Continued and said to the people, be quiet, don't cry, don't be sad. Just because and the implication is just because you don't seem to know what's in the Torah. But I tell you now, we're telling you, it's a good day. Go back home and eat and drink and enjoy the day. And the people went home to eat and drink and send gifts of food, to make a big festive day, because they understood what they were taught. The next day, the next day they said, okay, we want to hear more. And they found it was written in the Torah, that Hashem had commanded Moshe. Oh, guess what? There's a holiday. And that holiday is called Sukkot. And it takes place now, it's coming up. And it's in the 7th month, and we have to do something about it. And when they heard this, the word went out in Yerushalayim and all the surrounding areas saying, Tze'u, go out. Tze'u hahar v'haviu alei zayit, alei eitz shemen, alei hadas, alei temarim, alei eitz avot, lasot sukkot kakatuv, v'chulei, v'chulei, v'chulei. What is happening here? This is a very, very different picture, these two stories. The one that's in Sefer Ezra and the what's in Sefer Nehemiah have a different picture. We're going to look at right now. I'm going to read something to you. Oops, wrong. Share this. I'm going to read through this, not real fast, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. This is a short article that's actually found on the 929 website about this instance. It's going to end in a teku. What's a teku? So for those of you, it's not a tie. Modern Hebrew uses the word teku for tie. But in Aramaic, in the Gemara, teku stands for tishbi taretz kushiot ve'abayot. When a Gemara comes to an inconclusive ending to a question, and they're not sure is halacha this way or that way, the Gemara comes to the statement of teku. This is going to come to a teku also. Sorry for the spoiler alerts. I'm going to read through this real quickly. Ezra ta'er idealia datit shel am ha'ovedet elokav. The way you look at Sefer Ezra, this chapter we just read, or these couple psukim about Sukkot, he seems to describe a very idyllic religious people serving God. Umakirat mitzvot haTorah. There's nowhere when you look at these psukim that would indicate that they don't know what they're doing, or that they were unfamiliar with Sukkot, or that they were unfamiliar with the concept of what they were supposed to be doing. They didn't necessarily know every detail, but there's nowhere that indicates the opposite of the way it sounds like in Nehemiah. למרות האיום של עמי ארצות, למרות שהמקדש עדיין לא הוקם, in spite of the fact that there was a threat from the other nations there in Israel, and in spite of the fact there was still not yet a Beit HaMikdash, bonim shavei Tzion mizbeach laHashem. The people come back and they build this mizbeach. Umakrivim alav et korbanot chag haSukkot yom yom, and they would bring every day. They brought the korbanot every day if necessary for the chag. Hakol al pi horaot haTorah u'mitzvotah. And everything was done based on the rulings of the Torah. Nehemiah lu'umat zot, but in Sefer Nehemiah, matzik tmuna harbe pachot idealit. The picture that Nehemiah gives us, the one we just looked at, Perek Chet in Nehemiah, is much less than ideal for what compared to here. Shavei Tzion mitasvim b'tchilat hachodesh berchov ha'ir Yerushalayim. The way it's described over there is that the first of the beginning of the month, i.e. Rosh Hashanah, they get together. They're gathering in the streets of Jerusalem. From the mouth of Ezra Sofer. Now, wait a minute. We haven't even mentioned that Ezra went back. Remember, we don't meet Ezra until Perek Zayin in Sefer Ezra. We'll deal with that later. The biggest first stumbling block, and we're going to see this when we get into Sefer Nehemiah, was that the people didn't really understand the Hebrew of the Torah. Remember now, you should not remember, but there is a monstrous difference, huge difference in the letters, the way the Torah was originally written and the way we have it today. Now I say today, it's been a very, very long time since it has been changed, which one day I'll give you a shiur on that. But right now, just suffice it to say, they did not understand the language. And they also needed translators, mevinim, which are referred to as the mevinim, the understanders. Shitvaku et divrei haTorah lahakahal harav v'tzameh hadat. They were there to explain to the people who were thirsty for knowledge. Understanding the psukim was only the first of the challenges. When they did understand and what was explained to them, what the Torah demanded of them for Chag HaSukkot, they burst out in tears. Or for Rosh Hashanah, or for keeping Torah in general, because they were taught, maybe they were reading from Parshat Kitavo, the Tochacha. They're crying because they suddenly realized that they never did, at least properly, keep the Torah properly, or maybe were completely unaware of the Torah's requirements. And evidently didn't even know what was written in the Torah for some of these people. And so the leaders of the Am Yisrael were trying to quiet down the cries by saying today's a holiday, you gotta be happy. The people went back home, they went back dejected, feeling that they have to be happy. And he concludes by saying, Shnei panim l'sipur al Chag HaSukkot harishon shechagagu shavei Tzion lachar chazaratam la'eretz Yehuda. This is two different perspectives between two different books, the one of Ezra and the one of Nehemiah, of what did it look like to the outsider? What were they experiencing? How did they feel? How did they relate to the Chag between these two books? According to one, i.e. here in Ezra, it was recognized. They knew what was the Chag was. They loved the holiday. They did it with happiness and proper spirit. Asheni, in the second story in Nehemiah, all they knew was that there's a Torah, and it required us to do things. But they didn't know what was in it exactly and how to keep the mitzvot. Which one, here's where we're going to end up with the teku. Which one's closer to the truth and to the historical fact? So he says, we're going to leave the question open. So what we're going to do, Bezrat Hashem, when we do get to Sefer Nehemiah, we're going to revisit this whole section and the comparison. I wanted to get through the rest of Sefer Ezra and into Sefer Nehemiah before we can really deal with it, because we'll have to put a few things into perspective. Okay,
Rabbi, I had a question.
please.
Sometimes there are events that happen that two people see it and they have two completely, opposite ways that they view it.
Very
Couldn't
good.
both of them potentially be correct?
Yes.
Where people, can know what the Chag is, but maybe they didn't know how to read the Torah, but they knew what it was. They had a feeling. These are people who came who were spiritually elevated. Maybe they weren't so quick on the draw in terms of exactly what was in the Torah, but I don't know. Couldn't both be happening at the same time?
So the answer is you're correct. We'll see that when we get into Nehemiah. The question is that the author of this article leads us down a path that may or may not be 100% accurate, because if you look at the Mefarshim, some of them make very light of it. It's like maybe it was a few people, it wasn't all the people. So yeah, it's also like you say, the perspective could have been very different. It's also when you now remember, of course, Tanakh is not a history book, but we do have Jewish history woven into Tanakh, and history is the history is from the viewpoint of the author, right? So we talked about the authorship of Ezra and Nehemiah. There's Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, that Ezra write Ezra, was it written by him, with him? So it's a whole bunch of other possibilities. But yeah, it is definitely possible what you said. To believe that all of Am Yisrael who came had absolutely no clue is very hard to say. But we also have to understand the background, because part of the background is, which we'll see when we get to Sefer Nehemiah, has to do with what's called hitbolelut. That's modern Hebrew. Hitbolelut is assimilation. One of the biggest challenges for those who came back from the Golah was they had come back with non-Jewish wives. Thousands of Jews returned, males whose wives were not Jewish. And Nehemiah's biggest challenge was getting them to get separate from their non-Jewish wives and to marry Jewish women. So just imagine, put it into modern terms, that you have all of a sudden from communities all over North America where the intermarriage rate is in the 70% range, and in some cases have almost absolutely no background or knowledge of what's in the Torah. Suddenly they're moved to come to Israel, and they come and they establish a community in Israel, and they want to do the right thing. They want to be choser b'tshuva. They want to it's under the guidance of some very powerful Rav who can give them the proper direction. And he starts opening the Torah and they say, Ve'izmir. This is insane. I didn't know any of this stuff. How am I supposed to catch up? So yeah, there's a yesh v'yesh. So when we get there down the road, Bezrat Hashem, we'll have to come back to this particular point. Let's read a couple more psukim. Look at pasuk Zion, please. Okay, we're just going to read one thing, this pasuk, and one more point on it. Vayitnu chesef lachotzim v'charashim ma'chalu mishteh v'shem v'tzidonim v'tzorim v'yetzei arazim min ha'levanon el yam yafo. This is what were paid, the various people, various artisans that were brought to Israel, who came to be stone cutters and hewers and masons and wood choppers, and all these people were brought in along with the cedars from Lebanon, just like in the first Beit HaMikdash. They were brought to the port in Yafo. By the way, you'll notice Yafo ends with an aleph, and there's a comment from the Minchat Shai. Minchat Shai is a commentary which generally deals with Masoretic text, meaning the spelling of a word, the location of a word. He talks about this is one of two places in Tanakh, he said, where the aleph is added with has no connection to the word. One place here and one other, I forgot where it was. And then it says, where I want to just mention is his last words here, Kirishyon Koresh Melech Paras Alehem, as was given permission to them, or authority, license, by Koresh, king of Pras of Persia. Now, if we were forgetful, we might forget that we're in the book of Ezra that began with the king of Persia giving permission to the Jews to go back and build Beit HaMikdash. So I guess maybe it would seem that Ezra felt that we would be forgetful, and reminds us in the middle of Parag Gimel, oh, and by the way, it's all being done with the permission of the king. Why is it there? Let's take a quick look at something that the Dat Sofrim tells us. מכאן נראה שהיה משא ומתן עם המלך על פרטי הבנייה. From here, it appears that there was, in fact, a back and forth dealing, a discussion between the Jews and the king of Persia regarding the details of the building. V'hem bikshu mekoresh, and they requested from Koresh, v'hu hirsha lahem, they requested from Koresh, and he permitted them, לקחת עצים מן הלבנון, שכבר היה אז בידי פרס. Okay, what did he tell the Jews? You go back, you build your Beit HaMikdash, you have my permission to do that, right? But what about, he didn't say anything about importing product and paying people. Maybe it should just all be done internally within the country of Israel. So what it's telling us is that there was the discussion for which they received permission from the king to import from Lebanon and bring it to Israel. And on top of that, Persia was part of his kingdom. That made it even better. It's also possible. The other way to look at this is, what does this mean, permission? Doesn't mean that they needed his permission to import it, but rather that they took the trees with having not to pay for them from the forests, from the kingdom, from the king's kingdom. Because this is what Koresh meant or intended when he commanded, we're going to see later in Perek Vav that he said that any expenses would come for the building Beit HaMikdash from the treasure of the king, or the kitty of the kingdom. So therefore, that they didn't have to necessarily pay for them. So it's two different perspectives. Either they imported the wood from Lebanon and they paid for it in such and such a way, and they did that with the permission of the king, or they brought the stuff in. It wasn't that they needed his permission to import it, but they didn't pay for it at all, because it was something that the king himself said that they were entitled to take from his forests. Either way, the one is not necessarily right and the other wrong. It's just the different perspectives. So Bezrat Hashem next week on Sunday night, Bezrat Hashem, I'd like to do, we got up to Pasuk Zayin. We have a few more psukim, obviously, to do in this parak. We have about 2 or 3 more points I'd like to make in this parak regarding the Levi'im, and a couple of little surprise points that may come up. In the meantime, Bezrat Hashem, I wish everyone a Shavua Tov, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. The few goes so quick.
Yes. Baruch Hashem.
Did you get a message from me?
When?
An email? I sent